Advanced Residential Applications and Case Studies. Chapter 2, Advanced Residential Appraisal Concepts. Page 7. The Problem Identification Process. Standards Rule 1-1A states that the appraiser must be aware of, understand, and correctly employ those recognized methods and techniques that are necessary to produce a credible appraisal. And the comment to this rule states, in part, the appraisal profession is constantly reviewing and revising appraisal methods and techniques and devising new methods and techniques to meet new circumstances. For this reason, it is not sufficient for appraisers to simply maintain the skills and the knowledge they possess when they become appraisers. Each appraiser must continuously improve his or her skills to remain proficient in real property appraisal. Standards Rule 1-1 requires the appraiser to use methods and techniques that are recognized by appraisers and users of appraisal services. If a non-traditional method or technique is used, it is incumbent upon the appraiser to provide an adequate explanation of the technique used, along with why the appraiser feels it was the appropriate way to solve the appraisal problem at hand. Your appraisal education will continue throughout your career, and with every year that passes, you will find yourself competent to complete assignments that you would not have been qualified to complete a year earlier. Problem identification is required to determine competence. In order to determine if you have the required knowledge and experience for an assignment, complex or not, you must have some idea of the nature of the assignment. The competency rule points out that this is accomplished by way of identifying the appraisal problem to be addressed. End of page. Page 8. Standards Rule 1-2. In your earlier appraisal courses, you learned about the appraisal process, which includes several steps. The first of which is problem identification. Standards Rule 1-2 of USPAP provides us with a concise presentation of the steps required to properly identify the appraisal problem. In developing a real property appraisal, an appraiser must A. Identify the client and other intended users. B. Identify the intended use of the appraiser's opinions and conclusions. Comment. An appraiser must not allow the intended use of an assignment or a client's objectives to cause the assignment results to be biased. C. Identify the type and definition of value and ascertain whether the value is to be the most probable price. Roman numeral 1, in terms of cash, or Roman numeral 2, in terms of financial arrangements equivalent to cash, or Roman numeral 3, in other precisely defined terms, and Roman numeral 4, if the opinion of value is to be based on non-market financing or financing with unusual conditions or incentives. Identify the terms of such financing and any influences on value. Comment. When reasonable exposure time is a component of the definition of value for the value opinion being developed, the appraiser must also develop an opinion of reasonable exposure time linked to that value opinion. Note: the requirement for an appraiser to develop an opinion of reasonable exposure time, when reasonable exposure time is a component of the value definition being used in the assignment. In most residential mortgage lending appraisal assignments, the definition of value used comes from either Fannie Mae / Freddie Mac or the Federal Financial Institution regulatory agencies. If you read the definition of market value used in these assignments, you will see that reasonable exposure time is a component of these definitions. Continuing with the problem identification elements in Standards Rule 1-2. D. Identify the effective date of the appraiser's opinions and conclusions. E. Identify from sources the appraiser reasonably believes to be reliable. That's highlighted. The characteristics of the property that are relevant to the type and definition of value and intended use of the appraisal, including Roman numeral 1, its location and physical, legal, and economic characteristics. Roman numeral 2, the real property interest to be valued. Roman numeral 3, any personal property, trade fixtures, or intangible assets that are not real property but are included in the appraisal. Roman numeral 4, any known easements, restrictions, encumbrances, leases, reservations, covenants, contracts, declarations, special assessments, ordinances, or other items of a similar nature. And Roman numeral 5, whether the subject property is a fractional interest, physical segment, or partial holding. An appraiser may use any combination of a property inspection documents, such as a legal description, address, map reference, copy of a survey or map, property sketch, photographs, or other information to identify the relevant characteristics of the subject property. When appraising proposed improvements, an appraiser must examine and have available for future examination plans, specifications, or other documentation sufficient to identify the extent and character of the proposed improvements. Identification of the real property interest appraised can be based on a review of copies or summaries of title descriptions or other documents that set forth any known encumbrances. An appraiser is not required to value the whole when the subject of the appraisal is a fractional interest, a physical segment, or a partial holding. If you were careful to review Standards Rule 1-2 above, some of the complex property issues we discussed earlier should have been apparent to you, such as the physical characteristics of the property, which means type of construction, or ownership interest to be appraised, which means was it fee simple, was it leased fee, was it a life estate, for instance. The problem identification process requires you to develop an adequate understanding of the assignment through completion of those steps listed in Standards Rule 1-2. As you can see, there is more involved in this process than merely understanding the property to be appraised. We will continue with Standards Rule 1-2 on the next page. End of page.